She had 5 deformed children with her own father, the darkest secret ever revealed among the Amish in the USA. Hidden for decades amid Pennsylvania's verdant plains, between well-tended fields and the constant sound of carriage wheels on dirt roads, lay a disturbing reality. Our story starts in the summer of 1962, when a 16-year-old Amish girl named Sarah Staltz suddenly vanished from her Lancaster County community. No one suspected the truth. Sarah hadn't run away. Instead, she had been hidden by her own father, Jacob Staltz, in an isolated cabin deep on the family property, far from the community's curious eyes. Jacob, a 42-year-old widower, had lost his wife 3 years earlier during the birth of their 6th child. The loss changed him. Once respected for his religious devotion and hard work at the local carpentry shop, he now lived within a community known for deliberate isolation from the modern world, wearing simple clothes, rejecting electricity and automobiles. They lived by centuries-old traditions, prioritizing family, manual labor, and faith. This very isolation created a perfect environment for secrets to stay buried. The first suspicion surfaced only in 1967, when a local midwife, Ruth Miller, was urgently called to the Staltz property. There she found Sarah, now 21, in advanced labor. What the midwife witnessed that night would haunt her forever. The newborn displayed alarming traits: a disproportionately small head, widely spaced eyes, and fused fingers. Something was wrong in that family, Ruth reported years later. Sarah seemed a prisoner, not a mother. Jacob stood not as a grandfather awaiting a birth, but as a man watching his property. The midwife also noticed 2 other small children in the cabin, all with similar physical features, a disturbing repetition of abnormal traits. The marks of consanguinity were clear in the children: cognitive issues, facial malformations, motor difficulties, and in some cases severe heart problems. Ruth didn't know this was already the 3rd child from that forbidden union. The other 2, hidden from the community, showed even more severe conditions. In the Amish community, cousin marriages weren't rare due to population isolation, but a union between father and daughter was an unforgivable transgression. The local bishop, Eli Yoder, kept strict control over marriages to avoid close unions, yet Sarah's situation never reached him. The cabin where Sarah lived sat almost 2 kilometers from the main Staltz house, hidden deep among dense trees. Jacob had built it years before, claiming it was a storage shed. The simple structure had just 2 rooms, one for sleeping, another that served as kitchen and living area. Small windows, covered with dark fabric, kept the interior gloomy even by day. Jacob's other children, 2 boys and 2 girls, had been sent to live with relatives in Amish communities in Ohio and Indiana soon after their mother's death. This strategic move removed potential witnesses. When asked about his daughter's disappearance, Jacob would only say she'd been sent to help a sick aunt in another community. The vague explanation was accepted without much question, as the Amish valued family privacy above almost all else. After seeing Sarah's living conditions, midwife Ruth faced a moral dilemma. Revealing what she'd seen meant breaking trust, staying silent meant consenting to continued suffering. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. These stories reveal humanity's darkest truths, ones you need to know before time buries them again. The second chapter of this dark story unfolded in 1970, when Sarah Staltz gave birth to her 4th child in even more precarious conditions. By then, her body showed visible wear from consecutive pregnancies and confinement. At only 24, she looked twice her age, with prematurely gray hair and an empty gaze. Ruth Miller, the midwife, had decided to break her silence, but cautiously. Without directly confronting authorities or the bishop, she began visiting the cabin periodically, bringing food, clothes, and basic medicines. These discreet visits let her gradually document the situation. Sarah's 4th child, a boy Jacob named Elam, was born with problems more severe than his siblings: legs bowed at impossible angles, a severe facial deformity that made feeding difficult, fused fingers like small claws, and a constant wee signaling lung issues. The scientific community was well aware of consanguinity's effects. By the 1970s, studies showed how reproduction between close relatives dramatically increases the chance of problematic recessive genes emerging, resulting in various congenital conditions. For the Staltz children, the deformity pattern followed exactly what was expected in cases of parental incest. Each new child seemed to present more serious problems than the last, Ruth observed in notes found decades later. It was like watching a cruel real-time demonstration of genetic dangers. The three older children, Isaiah, 8, Rebecca, 6, and Daniel, 3, showed different degrees of impairment. Isaiah had severe cognitive difficulties and could barely form sentences. Rebecca had an abnormal spinal curvature and near blindness. Daniel suffered frequent seizures that weakened his nervous system. Jacob kept the children utterly isolated. They never attended the local Amish school, never went to Sunday services or community meetings. Officially, these children did not exist, no birth records, no vaccination cards, no documentation. Ruth discovered Jacob justified his behavior with distorted scripture readings. Her notes mention he quoted biblical passages about maintaining lineage purity and obeying the father as one obeys God. This religious manipulation worked on Sarah, raised never to question paternal authority. Over the years, the cabin deteriorated. The roof leaked, winter cold seeped through wall cracks. The children all slept together on a single straw mattress. Sarah had a small bed in the opposite corner. Jacob rarely stayed overnight, returning to the main house to keep up appearances as a devoted widower. Their diet was precarious, mostly what Jacob brought on irregular visits: bread, potatoes, occasionally milk and eggs. The older children showed clear malnutrition, thin limbs, distended bellies. Sarah tried growing a small garden in warmer months, but her own poor health limited what she could produce. The winter of 1971 was especially harsh in Lancaster County. Blizzards isolated the remote cabin further. For nearly 3 weeks, Jacob couldn't reach the hideout due to deep snow. When he finally arrived, he found little Elam dead, his fragile body unable to withstand the cold and lack of food. Instead of reporting the death or arranging a proper burial, Jacob wrapped the child in a blanket and buried him behind the property under an old oak tree. No ceremony, no headstone, no acknowledgement Elam had ever existed. Ruth, prevented from visiting by the weather, was horrified when she learned what happened. This tragedy finally convinced her to take more drastic action. She began systematically documenting her observations, each child's physical state, the cabin's conditions, Jacob and Sarah's behavior. Meanwhile, American society was changing. The 1970s brought greater awareness of domestic abuse and children's rights. Mandatory reporting laws for health professionals were spreading, but Amish communities often remained isolated pockets where authorities rarely interfered. The year 1973 marked a turning point. Sarah, now 27 and pregnant with her 5th child, began showing signs of resistance for the first time. Ruth's notes record subtle changes, hesitant questions about the outside world, requests for books to teach the children to read, and questions about why her children were born different. "Today Sarah asked me if all children are born like hers," Ruth wrote. "When I explained no, that her children had special conditions, I saw something awaken in her eyes, a recognition, maybe even an understanding." Sarah's growing awareness coincided with shifts in family dynamics. Isaiah, now 11, began showing aggression toward his grandfather. Despite cognitive limits, the boy seemed to instinctively position himself as protector of his mother and siblings during Jacob's visits. In a community where history and traditions were oral, Sarah grew up with limited knowledge of human reproduction and heredity. Her formal education ended at 14, and topics of intimacy were rarely discussed. This gap enabled Jacob's manipulation over the years. Recognizing this vulnerability, Ruth began to educate Sarah discreetly, using simple language and analogies from animal breeding, something familiar in the Amish context. She carefully explained the dangers of consanguineous relationships. Just as you shouldn't cross horses of the same blood because the foals are born weak, the same happens with people. Sarah's 5th pregnancy proved more complicated still. At 7 months, she developed severe preeclampsia, extreme swelling, intense headaches, blurred vision. Ruth, with her limited experience, recognized the gravity and insisted to Jacob that Sarah needed hospital care. "If she doesn't receive adequate care, both she and the baby could die," the midwife warned. Not even you will be able to hide 2 deaths. Reluctantly, Jacob allowed Ruth to take Sarah to a small hospital in York, about 40 kilometers away. To protect his secret, he instructed Sarah to use his late wife's maiden name and claim she was an Amish widow. Ruth, though complicit in the lie, saw the hospitalization as a chance to officially document Sarah's condition. At the hospital, doctors were alarmed by the young woman's state. Beyond preeclampsia, she showed signs of chronic malnutrition, multiple poorly healed fractures, and severe anemia. The medical team also noted scars from previous births, contradicting the story of a young primiparous widow. Dr. Martin Reynolds, the obstetrician on the case, recorded his suspicions in a confidential report. The patient presents signs consistent with high-risk pregnancy aggravated by possible prolonged mistreatment. I recommend social evaluation and follow-up after discharge. Alone with Sarah while Ruth filled out forms, Dr. Reynolds tried to learn more. Sarah, are you safe at home? Is there anyone who causes you fear or who might be harming you or your other children? In that crucial moment, something broke inside Sarah. Years of conditioning and fear had silenced her, but weeks of talks with Ruth and this doctor's genuine concern made her consider a different life. I need you to share this story. If you're watching now, leave a comment saying, "These children deserved protection." We cannot allow stories like this to remain in the shadows. Your voice makes a difference. The birth was induced early due to risks to Sarah's health. The girl born, whom Sarah silently named Hope, weighed only 1.8 kilograms and, like her siblings, showed visible congenital anomalies, a severe cleft palate, disproportionately short limbs, and serious respiratory problems. Dr. Reynolds, now certain he was facing consanguinity, ordered basic genetic tests available at the time. Preliminary results confirmed his suspicions. The homozygosity pattern matched what's expected in parental incest. Though detailed genetic analysis was still limited in the early 1970s, the markers were enough to alarm the medical team. During 10 days of hospitalization, Sarah began trusting the hospital social worker, Martha Clean. While little hope fought for her life in the neonatal unit, Sarah, for the first time, felt heard. In fragmented conversations, she started revealing details of her life in captivity. The autumn of 1973 brought winds of change. While Sarah and newborn Hope remained under medical care, a silent investigation took shape. Martha Clean contacted Lancaster County Sheriff William Decker, sharing concerning information from Sarah. Decker, 58, with decades of experience dealing with local communities including the Amish, faced a delicate dilemma. The accusations were serious, but intervention in Amish matters was rarely well received and could complicate any investigation. "We need to proceed with extreme caution," Decker told Martha. "The Amish prefer to resolve problems internally. If we show up with patrol cars and uniforms, we risk finding nothing. Jacob could be alerted and hide evidence or flee with the children." Their strategy was meticulous. Decker contacted Bishop Eli Yoder, not to reveal suspicions about Jacob, but to discuss general child welfare in the community. Casually, he mentioned the Staltz name, watching the religious leader's reaction. "Jacob has been a reserved man since losing his wife," the bishop commented. "He remains faithful to our customs but rarely joins community meetings. His older children live with relatives, and his daughter Sarah was sent to Ohio years ago, from what I remember." This confirmation that the bishop believed Jacob's story was crucial. It meant the Amish community wasn't involved in covering up the crimes, making authorities' intervention easier without alienating the whole religious group. Ruth Miller finally handed over her diaries and notes to authorities. The material included approximate birth dates, detailed descriptions of the children's conditions, and a carefully drawn map showing the hidden cabin's location. On October 17, 1973, a discreet team, Sheriff Decker, 2 plainclothes deputies, a county doctor, and Martha Clean, approached the Staltz property. They used an ordinary vehicle, parked at a distance, and completed the journey on foot. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Isaiah, Rebecca, and Daniel lived in deplorable conditions. The smell of urine and mold filled the air. The children wore torn, dirty clothes. There were no toys, books, or stimulation. Furniture was limited to an unstable wooden table and 3 uneven benches. Dr. Howard Garrett, the accompanying physician, examined the children on site. His notes describe the 3 minors show clear signs of prolonged medical neglect. Isaiah has a severe untreated dental infection. Rebecca has a spinal curvature that, without intervention, will likely leave her completely incapacitated in a few years. Daniel has open wounds on his legs, possibly from vitamin deficiency. The operation was timed for when Jacob would be in town selling handcrafted furniture at the weekly market. Returning that afternoon, he was intercepted by Decker and his deputies at his property's entrance. Jacob's reaction was telling. Instead of surprise or indignation, he simply lowered his head and said, "So they finally found out." During initial interrogation at the Lancaster police station, Jacob tried justifying his actions with a distorted mix of religious principles and personal need. "After my wife died, I needed someone to take care of the house," he stated. Sarah was the oldest. It was her responsibility. "The children happened. I didn't plan it." Asked why he kept everything secret, he replied, "I knew you wouldn't understand. Our ways are different. We keep our families together. We take care of our own." This attempt to hide behind cultural practices was quickly rejected by both authorities and the Amish community itself. Bishop Eli Yoder, informed of the case, declared unequivocally, "This is not our way. Our faith would never allow such an abomination. Jacob disrespected not only your laws, but ours and especially God's." News spread fast, first among local authorities, then to the press. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette first published an article on October 25, 1973, with the careful headline, "Family Tragedy Discovered in Rural Pennsylvania Community." The piece avoided directly mentioning the Amish, but the location made it obvious to locals. Public reaction was horror and indignation. Letters to the editor expressed shock, compassion for the victims, and criticism of authorities for not discovering the case earlier. Some extreme voices even questioned the right of Amish communities to remain isolated, arguing it enabled abuse cover-ups. For Sarah, still recovering in the hospital with her newborn, events brought an emotional storm. Free from her father's control for the first time in 11 years, she faced an uncertain future, a 27-year-old Amish woman with no formal education beyond 8th grade, for children with special needs, and no modern world skills. Martha Kleen, who'd grown close to Sarah, guided her through this transition. "What do you want for your future, Sarah?" she gently asked. "I want my children to stay with me," Sarah replied with surprising determination. "I want them to see the sun every day, learn to read, and never be afraid again." Jacob Staltz trial in March 1974 set an important precedent in Pennsylvania. It was one of the first well-documented parental incest cases in the state, and certainly the first involving an Amish member. Cultural sensitivity required special precautions. Judge Henry Crawford ordered records partially sealed to protect the children's identities and restricted media coverage. Still, the Lancaster County courtroom was packed daily with people from neighboring counties, many calling it the region's trial of the century. Sarah, still fragile physically and emotionally, testified behind a screen to avoid facing her father. Her almost inaudible voice described years of manipulation and abuse. She told how Jacob isolated her after her mother's death, first restricting contact with other youth, then convincing her it was her duty to replace her mother in all aspects. He said it was God's will, Sarah testified. That in ancient times this was how families survived, that I was sinning if I disobeyed. Medical testimony devastated the defense. Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Garrett presented photographic evidence and detailed reports. Dr. Benjamin Harris, a University of Pennsylvania geneticist called as an expert, explained in accessible terms how parental consanguinity dramatically increases risks of congenital defects. In a union between unrelated people, the chance of serious genetic problems is about 3 to 4%, Dr. Harris explained. Between first cousins, it rises to 5 to 7%. But in parental incest like this, the risk shoots to 30 to 40%, with a tendency to increase with each consecutive generation. Jacob's defense, seeing the facts were undeniable, focused on mental competence and religious influence. His lawyer, Theodore Weiss, argued that Amish cultural isolation and distorted scripture interpretation created an alternate reality where Jacob didn't fully grasp the immorality and illegality of his actions. This strategy failed when former Amish members testified that incest was considered one of the gravest transgressions, explicitly called an abomination in sermons. After only 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty on all charges, inappropriate relationship with a minor, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and child neglect. Judge Crawford sentenced Jacob Staltz to 40 years without parole, ensuring he'd spend the rest of his life incarcerated. In sentencing, the judge made a statement later cited in law books for decades: this court recognizes and respects religious and cultural diversity. However, some lines cannot be crossed in the name of any belief or tradition. Protecting children from abuse transcends all cultural differences and represents a universal value this court has a sacred duty to uphold. For Sarah and her children, the trial's end began an equally challenging journey. Little Hope, now 6 months old, remained in fragile health, needing multiple surgeries for her cleft palate and congenital heart problems. Isaiah, Rebecca, and Daniel, after months in temporary homes during the trial, were finally reunited with their mother. Martha Clean, a tireless advocate, helped Sarah settle in a small house on York's outskirts, far enough from Lancaster to avoid stigma, but close enough to keep some connection to Amish culture, still part of her identity. A fund established through the local Mennonite church let Sarah receive financial support while learning to navigate the modern world. At 28, she got her driver's license, unthinkable in her past life, and began classes to complete her high school diploma. The Staltz children faced significant challenges. All four needed extensive therapies: physical, occupational, speech, and psychological. Isaiah, 12, had the cognitive level of a 5 or 6-year-old but showed surprising aptitude for music. Rebecca, partially blind, developed remarkable talent for clay sculpture, using touch to compensate for limited vision. Daniel, though still suffering occasional seizures, responded well to new anticonvulsants of the time. In 1976, 3 years after her liberation, Sarah was invited to share her story at a child abuse conference at Temple University in Philadelphia. With Martha's help, she prepared a brief speech. Her message was simple but powerful. I was taught the outside world was dangerous and only our community offered protection. I learned questioning authority was sin. Now I know silence can also be sin. My children paid the price for what wasn't said, for what no one wanted to see. Today I speak for them and for all children still living in the shadows of silence. The Staltz case led to significant changes in Pennsylvania's mandatory child abuse reporting laws. In 1977, the Sarah's Law expanded the list of professionals required to report signs of abuse to include midwives, clergy, and community school teachers, closing loopholes that had let the case stay hidden so long. For the Amish community, the case prompted self-reflection while maintaining their desire for separation. Many communities implemented stricter internal child welfare checks. Bishop Eli Yoder, deeply shaken for not seeing what happened literally under his nose, established regular home visits to all families with children in his congregation. The last Staltz child, Hope, died in 1980 at age 7 due to congenital heart complications. Despite best medical efforts, her multiple conditions overwhelmed her small body. Sarah, devastated but resilient, turned grief into purpose. Using some money raised for Hope's medical expenses, she started a small foundation in her daughter's memory, dedicated to supporting children with disabilities in isolated rural communities. The case's impact reached far beyond Lancaster County. Studies based on the family entered medical, social work, and law curricula at U.S. universities. The story highlighted not just the biological dangers of consanguinity, but the social factors letting such abuses stay hidden. Rebecca, who developed notable artistic talent despite physical limits, had her sculptures exhibited in a Philadelphia gallery in 1985. Her work, characterized by complex textures and organic forms, reflected a unique sensitivity shaped by experiencing the world largely through touch. A Philadelphia Inquirer critic described it as impalpable in its emotional honesty, revealing a depth of experience that transcends the artist's youth. Isaiah found his voice through music. Though cognitive limits remained, he had exceptional musical memory and could reproduce complex melodies after one hearing. A local Mennonite church offered him a choir place, where his pure, unaffected tenor often moved congregants to tears. Daniel, the most reserved sibling, found comfort in simple manual work. At 18, he began part-time in a carpentry shop run by former Amish who kept artisanal traditions. The irony of following his grandfather's professional footsteps wasn't lost on anyone, but Daniel transformed this dark legacy, specializing in wooden toys for children with special needs. Sarah Staltz earned her GED in 1978 at age 32. 2 years later, she enrolled in evening courses at York Community College, focusing on child development. Personal experience plus formal knowledge made her a valuable counselor for other abuse survivors. In 1983, 10 years after the case's discovery, Washington Post journalist Ellen Burrows sought Sarah for a retrospective piece. She found a transformed woman, confident, articulate, deeply committed to child protection. The resulting article, From Darkness to Advocacy, Sarah Staltz's Journey, received a Pulitzer Prize nomination that year. "I'll never be completely free of the past shadows," Sarah confided to Burrows. "But I've learned carrying these shadows doesn't mean being defined by them. Each time I help another family recognize abuse signs, each time I see my children achieve what seemed impossible years ago, I feel a little more weight lifted." The Staltz case legacy also changed medical procedures. In 1985, the University of Pennsylvania Hospital implemented a protocol, the Lancaster Protocol, designed to identify potential consanguinity cases based on doctors' documented observations of Sarah and her children. It was later adopted by hospitals nationwide. Jacob Staltz first died in prison in 1991 at 71, having never shown genuine remorse. He refused all contact attempts from Sarah or his children and asked for an Amish burial. The community allowed it but placed his grave in the remotest cemetery section, no headstone, no marking. Bishop Eli Yoder, overseeing the funeral as required, gave a brief but impactful sermon. "Today we bury not just a man, but a reminder of what happens when we stray from God's true teachings. May his story warn future generations, and may seeds of compassion planted through his family's suffering continue to flourish." Sarah never remarried or returned to the Amish community. She found her place in the English world but kept certain upbringing values, simplicity, hard work, and faith, though her faith evolved into a more personal, less dogmatic spirituality. When Isaiah died in 1995 at 33 from heart complications like his younger sisters, Sarah faced grief again with silent strength. The funeral, different from traditional Amish services, included Isaiah's own recorded hymns and emotional testimonies from those his gentleness and musicality had touched. The Staltz case remains a reference in studies on cultural isolation and its risks. Sociologists and anthropologists often cite it when discussing the balance between cultural autonomy and universal protection of basic human rights, especially for the most vulnerable. In 1998, marking the 25th anniversary of the case's discovery, the University of Pennsylvania held a symposium titled Beyond the Walls of Silence, Lessons from the Staltz Case. Sarah, then 52, was the keynote speaker. Her presentation, attended by health professionals, social workers, authorities, and students, received a minutes-long standing ovation. "My family's story isn't just about trauma and suffering," Sarah concluded. "It's also about human renewal, communities recognizing flaws and correcting them, systems evolving to better protect the vulnerable, and, mainly, the transformative power of truth, however painful." Rebecca and Daniel, the two surviving children, were present. Rebecca, now an established artist exploring themes of resilience and transformation, and Daniel, running a small workshop making adapted toys for children with disabilities, both embodied their mother's message that even from darkest circumstances, beauty and purpose can emerge. Though over 50 years old, the Staltz case still reverberates in discussions about cultural isolation, children's rights, and communities' role in monitoring their most vulnerable members. Pennsylvania's Sarah's Law was expanded and adapted by several states, strengthening child protection networks nationwide. For those studying consanguinity, the Staltz family offers one of the most complete documented cases of incest's physical, psychological, and social effects across multiple pregnancies. Medical records, preserved with protected identities for education, continue to be used in medicine and genetics programs. If you watched until here, you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can get to know who really likes the stories on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe to learn other equally impactful stories revealing humanity's darkest secrets. Leave your like to support our work, and share this video with someone who needs to know these hidden realities silently shaping our society. The Staltz story reminds us that some of the most important battles for justice and human dignity are fought away from the spotlight, in remote communities and seemingly invisible lives. It testifies to the power of witness, the courage needed to break abuse cycles, and the possibility of healing after unimaginable trauma. As Sarah said in her last public interview, given shortly before her death in 2015, "My hope is that no one else needs to live what we lived. But for those still trapped in similar situations, I want them to know there's a path out of the darkness. There are people willing to help, and there is life, a full, meaningful life, beyond abuse."